Not only do we have 5 generations in the workplace, but we also have the unique experience of having new employees whose college years and early work experience were immeasurably impacted by the pandemic. As managers, we are now navigating how to manage this cohort of folks to ensure that they thrive in the workplace. To help us learn how to lead Gen Z, I spoke with today's guest, Madeline Miller. Madeline is making executive coaching more accessible and inclusive for Gen Z and Millennials through her Dream Career Accelerator coaching program. As a coach, Madeline is known for helping her clients build the strongest career foundation possible by aligning their work and values, increasing visibility and influence through effective communication, and dismantling limiting self-beliefs that lead to perfectionism, people-pleasing, or despondency. Now, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. I share new episodes and other tips for managers every week. And here's the conversation. Thank you so much for joining me today, Madeline. I'm, of course, excited to talk about how to empower people, but especially our entry-level, kind of new into the workforce folks, because there is, I think it's been really hard, at least what I've been hearing from managers, is it's been really hard with the pandemic that kind of disrupted a lot of those early years for folks. And so how we can help support and cultivate those young people who are newly into the workforce. Really excited to learn from you today. So thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to talk about it.
So maybe we could actually just start where I was, which is, what are some of the challenges that you're seeing for these young people who are entering the workforce, who either missed those kind of early days or their first experience of the workplace was during the pandemic, or even now where they're kind of coming in, but maybe their college years were a little disrupted, or their life was just disrupted in general, and they're now experiencing the workplace?
I mean, that's a great question. And you're the first person that's asked me that question, kind of giving the answer. Like, is in, you get it. The current generation at work, like the people that are starting work now, really have started work in a completely unique environment. Like, they possibly finished college online. They possibly started work entirely online, which I don't think has ever happened before. They might continue to be working remote. Like, not everyone's gone back to hybrid. So they've really missed a lot of those, as you said, like formative years where you develop, the familiarity with the workplace. You can kind of manage a lot of anxiety by being physically in places with people like your manager, checking in, sort of asking for feedback, things that we all sort of took for granted, they're not getting. So I think there's a lot of this sort of criticism leveraged at Gen Zs and maybe some younger millennials about their work readiness. And I'm always I want to sort of see both sides. So I think that those criticisms, like the underlying concern is valid, right? There probably is a lack of work readiness. However, from the other side, I would say we need to look at why, and we need to come up with creative solutions to solve that.
It's totally valid to say, like, yeah, people they didn't get these skills. And so we can be frustrated as managers that we're having to deal with those kind of extra problems of having a new person on the job. And we also need to figure out how to support them, I think is what you're saying, right? Like, that it's not their fault they didn't get these things. It happened to an entire generation, and we need to figure out how to support them to learn those skills, even though it's happening a little later in life or kind of later into the experience. Maybe you could tell us a story to kick us off about a team or a person that you worked with who kind of went through that journey from maybe starting in a rough spot, kind of coming into a workplace, or maybe starting in the pandemic and then transitioning and kind of growing into like an awesome team member that we all hope we can have.
Personally, I've been working fully remote for about 7 years. So I haven't actually firsthand witnessed that, but through my clients and also the data that's interviewed a lot of Gen Z and millennials, I have seen how people can adapt to the workplace and develop those skills, but they're often finding resources themselves. And that's sort of the problem that I think we have in the modern workforce. I'll say Gen Z and millennials, but I'm really talking about that early career kind of professional, because millennials can go up to 40, right? Like, they've probably been working for a while. So the early career people, a lot of them are finding information, on relationships, interpersonal communications, workplace strategies online, right? On TikTok, on Instagram. And that's not necessarily bad. I'm glad that there's a lot more resources out there for people, but it's sort of a problem when they're not feeling like they're getting that support within the workplace. So there's definitely people that have excelled, and there's definitely companies that are doing great things for Gen Z and millennials. But I think people are tending to need to be more self-sufficient in their professional development. And I, as a coach who works with Gen Z and millennials, like I kind of fill that gap sometimes. Like I become their learning and development advisor, the professional growth advisor, perhaps their mentor. But I also encourage them to proactively seek that if they're not getting it at their jobs, because I think we talked a bit before about technology and remote work. That makes it harder to, as I said, get that feedback loop that they're really relying on to sort of develop those skills. So they need to learn to be more proactive about that. And like, I know, for example, when I started out at work, I was very anxious, like unnecessarily so, but I was very anxious. And one of the things I could do at least was sort of hover around the door of my boss's office, just hoping to like see him and check that he was not angry with me. I mean, it was not the best way of managing things, but I had that opportunity. If you're behind a computer all day, you don't get FaceTime, real FaceTime, not meta FaceTime with your boss, and you don't get maybe even a lot of synchronous communications. You're sort of left adrift, right? So I think there are definitely people who are thriving, and there are definitely workplaces that are doing the right things, but a lot of it's been left to self-learning, and I think that's a bit of a problem.
The other thing I think you're saying is that managers aren't being proactive at helping their team members. So it's not just maybe the organization having bigger policies, but if managers aren't reaching out and saying, hey, like it's an issue that, you're showing up in pajamas on Zoom, right? Or, hey, it's an issue that, I'm trying to get a hold of you and you're not responding to my messages in a timely manner. And let's define what timely means, right?
Yes.
And like, yes, I want you to have work-life balance and, be flexible and all those things. But let's also talk about what it looks like to be a professional in the workforce now. When instead we're kind of like, why is this person doing these things? Like, don't they know any better?
Yeah, we need to set expectations. And again, a lot of those things you learn on the job, right? You kind of started to understand like the workplace norms and cultures. It's very different if you're not going into an office. So there needs to be exactly like a more proactive discussion around what expectations are. But I think, and this is probably not what managers want to hear, I think these days managers have to sort of justify some of these expectations a little bit more than they did in the past. Because in the past, we were all collectively in the space together, and the organization had its own, and the physical space had its own sort of set of rules and layouts. Like now with remote work, we need to query some of these expectations we have and why we have them. Now, some are obvious, right? Turning up in your pajamas, sure, I can explain that. But, I expect you to be, communicating, or I'm just throwing something out there, like responding to my emails, within 20 minutes. Like, okay, but why? Like, what is the expectation here? What is the cultural expectation and what is the sort of professional expectation? Can we separate the two? What do I need to be doing to get my job done? And what do I need to be doing because that's just the way it is, right? That's the discussion we're not really having enough of.
Are there a couple of kind of key areas that you suggest managers really think about what those expectations are so that they can be proactive in sharing that information with probably all their team members, not even just the younger ones?
Anything that makes you respond with the words, that's the way I did it, probably needs you to take a beat and interrogate what that means for you. A lot of the time I talk to organizations about effective intergenerational leadership. And a lot of the time, the first thing I do is I ask them to question their belief. Okay, so yes, that's just the way it's always been done. Okay, what does that mean emotionally for you? Are you frustrated? Is there actually some pain about you having to have gone through that you're now just expecting other people to go through? It's a sort of like cycle of struggle that we're like, well, that's just the rite of passage in the workplace, because Gen Zs are saying, no, it's not. Right. And they're getting the reputation for being entitled and precocious and all of these things. But I think sometimes they're calling us out a little bit, right? They're holding up a mirror being like, hang on a minute, why is it like that? And we're like, well, that's just the way it's always been. It's like, is that good? Were you happy? Did you have great leadership? Did somebody teach you the principles of leadership, or did you just have to work it out yourself? So I think managers need to just take a beat and interrogate their own sort of self-beliefs before they start projecting them onto others.
I wonder about the sides of like professionalism, right? That there are some things that, even if we said like, this is the way it's always been and I need to like reflect on myself, but like there are some things that we kind of can quote all agree are how to be a professional. First of all, do you agree that there are things that kind of are professional and there are things that aren't professional? And then if so, do you have any thoughts on like, how do we explain these and justify them to our team members?
That is a very good question because this comes up a lot. Like if I talk to workplaces, some younger people are like, well, I'm like this in my personal life and you're telling me to be like authentic, but then you're also telling me to be professional. Like what am I meant to do? And it sort of does like cast a massive light on what it means to be professional. It's something that I have yet to come up with like a very clear, concise definition of. I know what it feels like to be professional. I know what it's like to work with people when they're not being professional. So I've tried, I'll give you a couple of examples from me running my own business now. Like I've always worked for companies. Now I'm out on my own, having my own consultancy. So I deal with a lot of service providers. And I've noticed sometimes, particularly the younger ones, I do a lot of stuff with younger people, a lot of stuff with social media. So like the people I'm working with tend to be younger than me. And I will often find that they're not professional, right? And so what that has meant to me is that they haven't respected my time. Their words and their actions are not congruent, right? Which is a sign of great leadership. That's how you build trust. So they're not building trust through their words and actions. They're not respecting my time in a way that I feel I'm respecting their time. So a perfect example was I was running late for a call with the service provider. I messaged him to say, I'm really sorry, I'm going to be late for the call. Can we push it or do you need to reschedule? He said, oh, actually, can we reschedule? Sure, fine. So we had it the next day. I turn up the next day waiting for the call. He's not there. He's not there. He's not there. I'm messaging him. He eventually messages me like an hour later saying, oh, sorry, I forgot. And I'm like, that's not professional because you know what it meant? I was like, I don't want to work with you anymore because you haven't respected my time. And I demonstrated to you how to respect my time because I modeled it, right? So I think, there's definitely things that are professional and it comes down to building trust, showing good leadership, being respectful of time. I worked with a couple of younger interns, like college age interns, and we had a few calls with external people. And so he was effectively representing my company. And he turned up to the call eating. And I was like, after the call, I said, well, when we meet with outside people, it doesn't look good. Again, I mean, that's a preference. Maybe it doesn't look good, but to be eating on the call because it looks like you're not ready, you haven't managed your time. It kind of looks almost disrespectful to the other person, right? And he said, I know, I was just really hungry. And I was like, I get it. Like, I'm often like racing to eat something before a call, but I know that when I show up, like I'm representing either myself or somebody else. And so I need to be respectful of how I'm interacting with that person and, the company I'm respecting. So, it's a gray line, something like respect, these kind of things that can feel very loaded. But I would say, it comes down to respecting other people's time, building trust through congruence through words and actions.
I love this definition of professional. And I think it's something that we can all reflect on for ourselves around like, what does that mean?
I actually want to think about this later because I think I could do like a whole post or like I could write something about this because like, what does it mean? Like there are these kind of just expectations and rules we've created and some of them might be innate, but some of them you learn.
Yes, absolutely. And I think there's even some questions around the idea of things that are professional have been cultivated as being professional because of the historic experience of them.
Yes,
and some
yes.
of that is biased. How do we have a new definition of professional that honors really what it means to be in a workplace and not a social setting, while also kind of giving people the freedom to be their authentic self in a way that isn't inhibiting or constricted by kind of outdated biases. So it's very messy. And I would love to see this article that you write because
as you're talking, I was like, also in written communications, like I have an expectation of what it means to be professional in written comms, but there's a lot of stuff out there about how, written communications are very different intergenerationally, people putting exclamation marks, putting smiley faces, reading into things. And there's this sense that like, oh, this is professional communications, this isn't. Younger people are changing that. They write very differently. So it's just so much stuff to think about.
I actually want to talk about something that kind of, you almost brought it up in one of your stories, right, about being proactive and saying like, I'm going to miss this call, I'm running late, or I'm going to miss this deadline, or I want to raise my hand for that opportunity, or I need help with this, or whatever it might be. I find that just even in general, but I think maybe even more amongst entry level people where they're kind of like still trying to get the lay of the land, that it's hard to be proactive sometimes. It's hard to do that. So any thoughts on like how we as managers can foster that kind of environment and kind of give that kind of feedback to help our team members really take ownership over their growth, over their success, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, no, again, really, really interesting stuff. I was listening actually to another episode of yours the other day where you were talking to somebody about one-on-one meetings and like how managers should be using them effectively for staff. I think that is a good opportunity to bring up with your reports limiting effects of making assumptions in the workplace, right? It can be very destructive if you are assuming what somebody meant, you're assuming that somebody feels. And I would, as a manager, I would try and impress upon my reports how it is always better to seek clarity rather than assume. And one way is to be proactive in setting a meeting or asking for feedback rather than making the assumption and running off with it, because that is the biggest problem within interpersonal communications, right? We make assumptions about what the other person's thinking or feeling. And that happens a lot in the workplace. And we put it down to, oh, we're busy, we're this. It's like, yeah, but think about the ramifications. And if you as a manager can think of an example where people assumed rather than sought clarification or sought feedback and the negative outcomes of that, like that is a great thing to share, because then I think it crystallizes it in people's minds so they can see the negative outcomes, for them or for the team.
Yes. I feel like this happens in meetings a lot where we kind of, have our conversation and then we kind of wrap it up without actually saying, okay, you are going to be responsible for this next step. I am going to be responsible for this next step. And here's the timeline that we're going to get them done by. And I've had this happen where I show up to the next meeting and it's like, great, did you do the thing? And they're like, I didn't know I was supposed to do that. I'm like, did we talk about this? And it's like, no, like there's not that clarity. And we do it too. We make assumptions about what someone else is going to be doing. And we don't necessarily always as managers, say, hey, are you taking this on? Is this going to happen? When is this going to get done? And so it does go both ways.
I was just thinking as you were speaking about a client I had the other day and how she was doing the same thing. And she was like not able to set a time with these people that she wanted a meeting with. And she's like, well, I know they've got other priorities. Well, I know. And I said, have you asked them? Like you're assuming what their needs are and you know what your needs are, but have you set a meeting that isn't driven around them having to do the task, but to getting to know what they need or they're feeling or they've got on their plate, or, have you sought extra information? Have you been curious? And, what you were saying then, I mean, in the meetings, like you could be like, hey, I'm curious about who's going to do this. But like, I think we need to be focusing on, don't assume, but be curious about what the other person might need and ask, because in every conversation you have, you get extra information and that information is really valuable.
Okay, I want to build on this because I am working on a new book around delegation. And one of the things that keeps coming up is around, as managers, like we need to say, like, this is what success looks like so that our people know, what needs to get done, when it needs to get done, and what success looks like, right? And that there's also a reciprocation of that. Whereas if I am on the other side of a delegated piece of work, or just in general, right? If I am not totally clear on something, I have an obligation to ask for that clarity, right? And to be curious, as you're saying, and to seek more information. And that if I don't do that, it's not just a quote failure of the manager, but it's actually a failure of the relationship, because it takes both of us to make sure we're on the same page. I want to move to a different type of kind of proactive, because there's proactive for seeking information, there's proactive for getting clarity, there's proactive for raising your hand, those things. But then there's also this like proactive sense that, and maybe I'm tying this into like the quiet quitting / the like, we don't want to do more than we have to, so we're just going to do the bare minimum, which is, I think, very different than the workplace maybe 10 or 15 years ago, where I would say there's more of an ethos of like, we are all going hard. Like we are all working as hard as we can, filling our days. And the sense of like work-life balance maybe wasn't so great back then. And we're trying to strive it to be a little better now. But there's also this thing about being proactive that's like, hey, I can do more. And I'm interested in doing more. And I'm interested in like challenging myself. Any thoughts on kind of where this generation, this kind of entry level people are at, and what we can do as managers to help them see the power that they have and to be more proactive about sharing ideas and leaning into the work?
The first thing I would say, perhaps as a slight maybe point of minor disagreement, is I've worked for a long time as well, right? So back in the day when we were in the office, which is a long time these days, and I would say that I'm not sure that it was any different. Some people have always worked really hard. Some people have worked less hard. I think what's different about that is that in the office, you can cultivate a sense of busyness or a sense of like drama and like being put upon, but you're not necessarily doing more work, right? So I just think back, I worked in a big government department and we had, long-term government employees, we had consultants come in, and even within like the consultancy and within the government employees, you think, oh, maybe they're different because it's private and public sector. The government has this reputation of, public servants. But I was like, no, I saw the consultants. Some worked their little butts off. Some were very good at like looking busy. So, it's across the board. It's not even sector based. I mean, that's all I would say on that. But I think your question probably is more around what I would call leadership qualities. So I think if you have a younger workforce who are checking out and maybe not showing initiative or motivation, or even considering that they're quiet quitting, you have a people problem. And I think the onus is on you as the senior leader to check in, because I think if people are doing that, they're unhappy. Now, I always encourage my clients to control what they can control. So I encourage them to be proactive if they're unhappy and all of those things. But like I said, there's a lot of factors making that extra hard these days. They've just started out at work. Like I think as a manager, you do have a responsibility. There is a level of pastoral care to like encourage and check in and be proactive, more proactive, right? But then again, have the conversations around why proactivity in the younger people is important for them to show. So that's one thing I would say. If you are a younger person and you want more, or you could do more, or you're excited about more, this is what I would say, cultivating a leadership mindset. Now, there are things that managers and leadership can do to cultivate that kind of mindset in young people. And I think they're the kind of programs I offer, which is like a group coaching format, like investing in leadership training for their very early employees. I think there is this sense that leadership resides at the top, but I would say that a leadership mentality should pervade throughout the whole organization, because a leadership mentality is like understanding, the type of team player you want to be, being proactive, showing initiative, being a great communicator, all of these things that we want our staff to show. Like we need to encourage that and cultivate that in them. And sometimes they need a little bit of a push, right? They need to be shown what that means, and they need to be shown why that's valuable. So I think that's really up to the organization to invest in, rather than sort of put entirely on the shoulders of the younger people.
Do you think it's fair to say that, if we just tell our people, hey, you are empowered to make these decisions, like just check in with me afterwards so that I'm tracking with what's happening, right? You are empowered, like, to go seek help when you need it. Right? Like don't just come to me because I'm not going to have all the answers, but I'm empowering you to like go find the answers. You are empowered to do these things, right? Is that enough for us to just keep like saying it over and over again, that we want you to be empowered and we want you to be proactive about solving your own problems, about, making decisions within the constraints of the project, about whatever it might be? Or is that just not enough? And there's actually other things that we have to do to help people really truly feel that sense of empowerment and be able to go off and act that way?
When I was starting at work, I was working in a law firm. So, big imposter syndrome, very anxious, as I said. And I was often empowered to go and run with something. That would have terrified me, or that did terrify me. Like, okay, you go and do it. I don't feel comfortable doing it. I don't feel confident doing it. I want someone to show me the right way to do it. Like, you're telling me to just reach out. Like, drafting an email would paralyze me. Like, I don't know how to say it. What I do, I'd be deleting this, deleting that. So I think we need to set reasonable expectations. And again, we need to demonstrate through our own behavior what that might look like. So if you're empowering somebody to, go and get the information they need, I would start off by doing it with them or demonstrate. Like, you take them into the meeting, you put them on the call, show them what it looks like to get, to have those conversations, because and understand that they're in a different position to you. Like, they're not as senior as you, like they don't necessarily have, again, the experience, the contacts. So like, it's all very well to empower them, but help them, show them how. And then when they, give them the frameworks and then let them go off and do it.
I love this so much for two reasons. One, which is the farther we get from our own experience as being a new employee, the harder it is to remember what was hard about that time, right? And like, we think, I just want to be empowered to go do things, right? Like,
I don't want to be micromanaged.
And it actually can be really scary. And even though sometimes, we want to be empowered, then when we are empowered, suddenly we're like, wait a second, why? Now I'm really nervous about this, even though it's what I asked for.
Yeah. And then there's a big sense of like, you want to set a workplace where if you've empowered somebody young, like, early in their career to do something, you're not also putting the responsibility fully on them, because they will shirk away from that. They'll be like, hang on, this feels above, what I'm comfortable with. I just want to be here learning, right? So like, it's a fine line between burdening them and empowering them.
And I think your point about demonstrating and role modeling and kind of showing them and giving them that guidance is so important, because that's what helps them build the confidence, right? To get to the place where they can be empowered. And actually, I am thinking about one of my employees who was 20 years old. I was her first boss ever, her first manager. And the first month, we basically did everything together. We spent like 3 hours on Zoom calls every day where we went through all of the things. And it was a little bit exhausting, in fairness. And also, like, I was just role modeling for her. Like, these are all the things that I've been doing that you're now going to do. So I'm going to show you how I do them. You don't have to do them this way if this way doesn't work for you. But I want you to understand, she was like responding to emails on my behalf, right? So I'm like, I want you to understand, like, when I open this email and I read it, this is what I'm taking away. This is how I'm going to respond, right? And now we're going through this a couple of times, and now you're starting to get the themes. And, eventually she was able to manage my entire inbox and write emails on my behalf. And that's a beautiful thing to empower someone to do.
Yes, and you trust them. It takes it off your plate. Like, it is a true delegation.
And not to say that every manager has 3 hours a day to spend training someone, but there are other ways that we can demonstrate and help our team members get to that place where they truly then can be proactive. So, all right, I love this, but we have to wrap up. So tell us about a great manager that you worked for and what made this person such a fabulous boss.
I'm going to go a little bit back into my origin story about why I became a coach, because one of the things that I really felt after sort of almost 20 years in the workplace, I felt quite disappointed and defeated by, was that I never felt like I had had a great manager or leader. Now, I'd worked with some very smart people who taught me a lot of good technical knowledge. And, I definitely had got some great education through people I worked with, but I never had anybody that I looked up to and was like, hey, I want to be like that. I was completely self-taught. And actually, in becoming self-taught, I had to unlearn a lot of bad behaviors I had just inadvertently started to mirror because of the climates I worked in. Now, I worked in pretty, hardcore sort of competitive environments, law, entertainment, but a lot of people work in these types of like high pressured environments. So I realized when I was speaking to a lot of younger people, my clients, like they were experiencing the same thing. And it leads to a lot of self-doubt, and it leads to a lot of, like I said, like looking for information elsewhere. So I never had a great manager. It's sad. I think we should be doing better. This is part of what motivates me, part of my, my vision. Yeah, that's my honest answer.
I appreciate that. And I feel like that's why I do the work that I do as well. It's because I don't want anyone to ever have to give that answer
I'm like
when
that. I know.
they're asked. So we're kindred spirits here. All right. And where can people learn more about you and keep up with your work?
I have my own website, Coaching with Madeline. You can read more about my programs and my formula, which is the AIR formula for sustainable career success. So it's a building block formula of alignment, career and values alignment, developing influence, and healthy resilience. And I consider that the formula for sustainable success. So you can learn more about my AIR formula on my website. You can also follow me on Instagram and TikTok at Madeline Miller Coaching, where I share a lot of techniques and tips on how to sort of survive in the modern workforce.
Well, thank you again for joining me today. I feel like we had such a fun conversation and there's like still so much more to be said. So I want to see that article when you write it.
Yeah, I know. I'm going to like make a note afterwards, like, what is professionalism?